Good afternoon, and thank you for joining NCPERS Center for Online Learning. My name is Hank Kim, and I'm the Executive Director and Counsel for the National Conference on Public Employee Retirement Systems. Today, we are hosting a webcast on state and federal legislation outlook for 2016. As the new year has just started in this presidential election year, we felt it was a good time to check in and see what's transpired since our July 22nd webcast from last year, and to look ahead to see what 2016 may have in store for public pensions and retirement security. Joining me today are two familiar figures from our past webcams. First is Bailey Childers, Executive Director of the National Public Pension Coalition, also known as NPPC, and Tony Roda, partner at the law and lobbying firm of Williams & Jensen. New to the panel is Angela Antonelli, Executive Director of the Georgetown University Center on Retirement Initiatives. Welcome, everyone. The following format is what we have planned for you today. We will have a moderated conversation with our three panelists covering select state and federal legislation. We encourage audience members to participate by submitting questions for our panelists through the GoToMeetings questions portal. However, to ensure that we can cover as many topics as possible, we will hold all questions till the last part of the program. We have a lot to cover, so let's get right to it. Tony, I want to start with you, but before we talk about the lot of activities that happened at the end of 2015, do you want to talk a little bit about what your firm, Williams & Jensen, does for public plans?
Sure, absolutely, Hank, and good afternoon and good morning to everyone who's out there. It's great to be back, and with Bailey and Angela as well. Williams & Jensen is a homegrown Washington, D.C. law and lobbying firm, about 25 principals. D.C. is our only office, and our only focus is federal legislation and regulatory affairs. And it's been a high point in my professional career for the past 12 years or so, to work with the state and local governmental plan community. We represent NCPERS, very proud of that fact, as well as individual plans in Texas, California, Ohio, and Tennessee. So with that as background, I'll jump right into to the issues. And we did have a very busy end of 2015. We were gliding to closure of the Congress and adjournment until December 9th. And on December 9th, Senate Finance Committee Chairman Orrin Hatch introduced S 2381, which was legislation to assist the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico in their financial straits, the Puerto Rico Assistance Act. Two sections of that bill we believe were incongruent with the purpose of the bill and focused at state and local plans in a way that we were opposed, and the public pension plan community was opposed.
And Tony, just to, sorry to interrupt, but in terms of that Puerto Rico bill, just as a quick background for folks, can you talk about why it was necessary and what the relief was intended to do?
I think there have been several proposals that have put out. The Commonwealth is struggling with meeting its bond payments, its pension payments, and its finances are in a serious condition. This has been an issue that has been really in the media for more than a year, and they've come to Congress and asked for relief. They've asked to be included in bankruptcy ability, Chapter 9, for municipal entities to declare bankruptcy. That is not part of Senator Hatch's legislation, but there are other areas to streamline and make it more able for them to work through their financial difficulties.
Good, thank you.
And I will add to that, this legislation was not concluded at the end of calendar year 2015, but it's really on a fast track for 2016. So the two provisions were revisions of previous legislation that we've seen. One commonly known as PEPTA, the Public Employee Pension Transparency Act, which would, for the first time, require state and local governmental plans to report their funding status to the Treasury Department, not only based on their assumed rate of return, but also on a Treasury obligation yield curve. So if your assumed rate of return is, the average I think is 7.6, 7.7, the Treasury obligation yield curve is going to require you to recalculate at somewhere between 3 and 4%. So you have an idea what that's going to do to your funding status. to the calculation of it. And then Senator Hatch included his annuity accumulation plan, which really is being positioned as a replacement for defined benefit plans. Annuities are certainly not something that are anathema to the way we do business. All of our payments are annuitized, essentially. But it's the positioning of it as the alternative and ultimate replacement. And as such, we have concerns about it, both as a consistent funding stream. There are only employer contributions to this plan, and those contributions can be changed from year to year and actually can go to zero. And for the public safety community, there are no survivor and disability benefits. So there was a skirmish, more of a skirmish than we anticipated, but we were pleased with the result at the end of 2015. Those particular provisions were not included in any end-of-year legislation.
Okay, thank you, Tony. And I know there's more stuff that happened, and we'll go back to you momentarily. But at this point, I want to turn it over to Bailey. Again, if you wouldn't mind beginning talking a little bit about what NPPC does, and then likewise at the state level. I think there was a lot of activity at the end of last year, so we would love to hear some of that.
Sure, and thank you for having me again, Hank. This is a fun thing to do, so I'm glad we're here talking about kind of what took place in 2015. So since we last met, most states wrapped up their legislatures without making any changes to their defined benefit pension. So I think, big message on the whole was a really good year at the state level for pensions. I think for a number of reasons, states are starting to recognize that we're kind of out of the recession years. Most pension systems have started to recover financially from trouble that they had during the recession. And kind of what we've seen about 401ks in the news, states are realizing that's not a good vehicle to provide retirement security for their public employees. So they chose to stick with their defined benefit pensions in 2015. So I'm happy to report that. A couple of states that did not finish their business at the end of 2015, Pennsylvania is a big one that comes to mind. So Pennsylvania has been operating without a budget since our last webcast, basically since July. And toward the end of the year, around, I guess, probably early December, there was a compromise that was struck between Governor Wolf and leaders of the Republican legislature to do a side-by-side hybrid plan, which is basically from salary $1, an employee would put part of their money into their defined benefit pension and part into a 401k. So it wasn't a complete loss of the defined benefit pension. It would have resulted in not great retirement security for the people under that system, but it was still at least retaining the DB component, which was a positive thing. In exchange, there were going to be a number of tax measures done to provide revenue for education. That's a major issue in the state of Pennsylvania right now. And so it seemed like that was going to go through, and then the House voted down the pension piece of the package that was agreed to. And since then, we're kind of just where we are. And so Pennsylvania continues to be without a 2015 budget. So it is not clear to me what's going to happen there, but we're not done quite yet. And then a couple of other states to mention. Michigan had a bill that I think I talked about last year, SB 102, that would move the Michigan public school retirement to a 401k. That did not move last year, but Michigan is in a 2-year cycle, so that can just continue onto the calendar for this year, but it did not move last year. And then Wisconsin, at the end of last year, there were a couple of bills introduced, one to make changes to final average salary calculations, the other to increase the retirement age. Those also did not move in Wisconsin, but can be carried over to this year. So those are the states that had some unfinished business out of 2015. The rest of the states that finished their legislative sessions, we actually saw some nice wins in some states to make pension systems more sustainable. Indiana is one that comes to mind that made some good fixes there. And the other two states that kind of didn't quite resolve their budget and pension problems are New Jersey and Illinois. So New Jersey, I talked about those court cases last year, but New Jersey continues to be where Chris Christie is not willing to make a full pension payment. So there are a couple of things being discussed now that I'll talk a little bit more about in the 2016 portion. And then Illinois continues to be in a kind of budget back and forth similar to Pennsylvania. So those two states were also ones kind of held over from 2015. But I think the good news is that, like I said, for the most part, we didn't see any big move away from defined benefit pensions in 2015. So that's very encouraging.
Great. Thank you for that. So, Angela, welcome.
you.
Thanks for joining us.
Appreciate
and again, if you wouldn't mind elaborating a little bit about what the Center on Retirement Initiative does, and then going into all, and like at the federal level as well as at the state level, in terms of retirement security, a lot of activity happened in 2015.
No,
So
it's been an incredible
Yeah.
18 months. So again, thank you, Hank, and it's great to be with Bailey and with Tony here for this session today, and a great opportunity to introduce the Georgetown Center for Retirement Initiatives, which, with the support of NCPERS and a lot of other organizations, really a diverse bipartisan set of organizations, unions, associations, financial firms that have come together to really establish this new research center. Again, we're about 18 years old. We're in the McCourt School of Public Policy, and basically what the purpose of the center is to be a trusted public policy center to states on retirement security. We provide technical assistance, information, data, policy analysis to states and other organizations interested in developing and promoting state-based retirement solutions for private sector workers. Now, unfortunately, approximately 50% of workers in the private sector workforce don't have the ability through their employers to save for retirement. And many of those who don't save, the primary reason is because they don't have access through their place of employment. And as a result, too many Americans are really facing their retirement financially unprepared. And there's lots of data to say that. A lot of folks have essentially no savings in retirement accounts. It's really quite troubling in the 54 to 64 age group, maybe $10,000 on average in the separate retirement savings account. The top financial concern in Gallup polling for the past 14 years is the issue of retirement security. People fear outliving their savings more than they fear death. This is a major concern for families around the country, and it's something that we need to address, and the wisdom of NCPERS and a lot of people to come together and create the Georgetown Center allows us to really be focused on these state initiatives and make a difference. And again, our mission is to strengthen the retirement security of American families, promoting the bipartisan adoption of innovative state policies, legislative initiatives, regulatory initiatives, administrative models, to essentially expand the availability and effectiveness of retirement solutions. Now, at the center, we have a lot of outstanding pension and investment professionals and practitioners and academic experts who make up our advisory council, including a bipartisan group of state treasurers. We have 15 of them that make up our state group. We connect state policymakers to scholars and these industry experts. We analyze legislative and regulatory developments, and as Hank has asked me to do, I'll talk a little bit about what's happening at the federal and state level. And we share research and best practices and generally serve as a resource to all states and to all stakeholders with an interest in expanding retirement security. And in the first 18 months, I think we've been off to a great start. I think we've had a significant impact. The Center's resources, including our legislative and implementation activities, have been designed as go-to resources for the states. And we're pleased that organizations in our first 18 months, like the U.S. Government Accountability Office, as well as the U.S. Department of Labor, have referred to the Georgetown Center for the work that we do. So what's happening? There's 2015 was an amazing year for progress on the state initiatives and the effort to close the retirement security gap that exists among private sector workers. As more than one person has said, for 40 years that gap has pretty much remained steady. And I think we're really at the point where I think a lot of us are very hopeful that for the first time in 40 years, we're going to see a major change and beginning to close that gap through these state initiatives. During 2016, again, we're going to be focused on continuing to advance legislative initiatives in the states and helping states adopt and get these programs off the ground. But as we look at what just the 2015, the year just closed, it was an amazing year. We had more than half of the states take legislative action to propose programs, in many cases an auto IRA type program, or to study the issues of retirement security and develop frameworks for what would work best in their states. And as we concluded 2015, we now have 5 states as we start 2016, and hopefully we will add in 2016, but as we ended 2015, we have new programs in California, Illinois, Oregon, Washington, and Massachusetts. That's amazing progress in a very short period of time. Now, critical to continuing expanding the programs in the states in 2016 has been the Department of Labor's recently proposed rule and regulatory guidance related to state-sponsored plans. States, in particular the auto IRA states, needed clarity as to whether or not their plans would be subject to ERISA. That is, would ERISA, the federal law, preempt state action? ERISA is a 40-year-old federal law, as many of you know, that outlines the fiduciary and consumer protections related to private sector pension plans. So the President in the summer of 2015 I'd like to think with the help of Georgetown and all the folks that have supported us, saw the momentum that was building in the states in terms of legislative activity. And the president announced in the summer of 2015, directing his agency, the Department of Labor, to clear the path for states to be able to move forward. And that was an exciting new development. So that was in the summer of 2015. So the DOL in November proposed these new policies, and many of us want to see these finalized in 2016 to give states the certainty they seek. So let me briefly describe the proposed reg. The proposed rule issued by the Department of Labor will close its comment period on Tuesday, January 19th. That's next week. DOL establishes a new safe harbor that would exempt from ERISA regulation state programs that require employers to automatically enroll their workers, and there is an opt-out provision for employees in the payroll deduction IRAs. Even with a safe harbor, the courts may ultimately decide this issue, so there's not complete elimination of any and all uncertainty, but the DOL action still offers states more certainty than they had before, and that's a positive development. The bottom line is states, as DOL has outlined in the proposed rule, have to set up their programs requiring employer participation, and this is again related to state auto IRAs, and assume responsibility for the integrity of the plan in order to be exempt from ERISA. Again, that public comment period closes January 19th. The center's website is cri.georgetown.edu. We want to be a one-stop resource on the issue of state initiatives, so for those of you tuning in today, please feel free to check out our website, and you'll be able to find information on all the state initiatives as well as the DOL proposed policies. The second element, which is not a proposed reg, but it is an interpretive bulletin, it's interpretive regulatory guidance, took effect immediately when DOL on November 18th outlined also models where states can support ERISA-covered plans. Because ERISA, as I said, provides important fiduciary and consumer protections for these types of retirement savings plans. And it speaks to three particular options: a marketplace model in which states connect employers to vetted savings plans. The marketplace itself is not subject to ERISA, but the plans within the marketplace would be subject to ERISA. As an example, a simple IRA is a type of an IRA that's an ERISA covered. There's also prototype plans, and there's also addresses the important issue of multiple employer plans, or MEPs. And it allows for states to open up MEPs and a loosening of the pre-existing commonality that has existed that was needed among employers. So now they can be more open. You don't have to have that necessary nexus of it all being firms in a particular industry to participate. And the state can then sponsor that, take the administrative off the burdens, and sponsor the plan. So there's been a tremendous amount of activity both at the state level, but as we concluded 2015. So a very active legislative session in early 2015. We're kicking that off now again in 2016. It's going to be quite active. But the great thing was that in response to that activity by the states in 2015, the administration responded. The federal government looked to the states and what they were trying to do to address retirement security issues, and have now provided through these policies the ability for these states to continue to move forward and to get some clarity so that they can in fact implement these programs and hopefully allow millions of more Americans to be able to save for their retirement.
Great news, Angela. Thank you. And we'll talk a little bit more about the regs and the interpretive bulletin as we talk about 2016. But Tony, let me turn it back over to you. Continue the good news. There were a number of other things at the federal level that I think we were very pleased with. So if you want to give us a little rundown on that.
Absolutely. It was a very active year in Congress with regard to state and local governmental pension plans, which is a little interesting. Yeah. But certainly all the work that Bailey does in the states and the headlines in the country have grown the congressional interest in this area quite a bit. The first two successes deal with public safety employees, and these are two issues that came to the fore rather quickly in the first instance. It was on survivor benefits. And it came out of an IRS investigation in New Hampshire where a state law-based survivor benefit of a public safety employee was being questioned as to its tax-exempt status. Congress moved very quickly. The senator from New Hampshire introduced legislation at the end of 2014. It was already across the Senate floor once by the end of calendar year 2014. And in 2015, a new law was enacted, created by the Congress and the President, Public Law 114-14. And what it says in very stark terms is a survivor benefit if in the line of duty on behalf of a public safety employee is tax exempt at the federal level, and whether that is state law based or federal law based. So that was something, again, that came up quickly but was dealt with quickly. So you give high remarks to Congress when they're able to do work in that manner in a bipartisan way. The second issue also dealt with public safety. It was a little longer burn, I'd say. These were amendments to the Pension Protection Act of 2006. In 2006, Congress created an exemption from the early withdrawal penalty, the 10% penalty, for qualified public safety employees who reach age 50 and separate from service. And that was limited to distributions from DB plans. Legislation had been introduced on this for years. We've worked on quite a bit of it during that time. So in 2015, amendments were made to the 2006 Act. And those amendments were really three-part. First, they added federal public safety employees to what had been just state and local. Matter of fairness, makes sense. In fact, there were two sets of amendments in 2015 in this regard because other high-risk professions were added, such as couriers of nuclear material, and others that kind of fell out of the federal-state classification, such as U.S. Supreme Court protected personnel, U.S. Capitol Police, and the Diplomatic Security Corps. So those were the amendments to add to the eligible class for this exemption. The second was to allow a distribution from a DC plan to also be exempt. Again, we started with just DB plans. This was critically important for the federal workers because of the thrift savings plan. So that was taken care of. And the third amendment, which is more technical and arcane, deals with whether you have created already a stream of payments of substantially equal amounts from your fund, and whether you then change that to a larger payment. You modify the stream. There had been IRS and Treasury guidance on that, saying if you modify the stream, you're subject to the recapture tax. This new law says that for distributions beginning with this calendar year, 2016, the recapture tax would not apply. So, this package of amendments is very positive. And the first two on public safety that I've mentioned we're very pleased with. This retirement benefit package is Public Law 114-26. The third item I'll talk about.
Actually, before you go on that, Tony, I do want to make a point regarding that 72T10 provision. Plans, the administrators and the board should probably take a look at that because there may be some state law implications or board policy that they may need to change in order to actually effectuate that change. So while, as you know, the 72T10 is a federal tax law, at the state level, they may need to make changes to their local regulations to make that.
Absolutely, that's a very good point.
Yeah.
People should take a close look at it because it is new law, and any new law will come with questions.
Sure.
We've learned that over the years. The third area is the excise tax and the Affordable Care Act. That is on so-called high-cost health insurance plans. We worked very aggressively on that, and in fact, in one of the end-of-year pieces of legislation, the effective date of the excise tax was pushed back from 2018 to 2020. I fully expect before 2020 for Congress to revisit this. Full repeal is possible. Changing the thresholds, very possible. But we're looking again, I think, at more legislation in this area before we've seen the end of it. The fourth success was a defensive success. In H.R. 5, which was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act reauthorization, the successor to No Child Left Behind, was a provision in the House that would have placed restrictions on the way teacher pensions are funded with regard to Title I monies which are based on a formula for a high percentage of low-income families. Those Title I monies under the House amendment could only be used for normal pension cost. Normal pension cost was then defined to say that it could not include excuse me, any accrued unfunded liabilities. You think of the complexities that this language is going to cause, and it was not lost on the state and local plans, the teacher plans out in the country. And Congress received numerous pleas to not go down this road. And the Senate, particularly Senate Health Committee Chairman Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, was very helpful in keeping this language out of the final conference report, which did become law. So it was a real threat.
Yeah.
It was a bill that was moving through the process. And then finally, administrative, it wasn't administrative relief, it was legislative relief on an administrative mechanism. And the mechanism would be to increase the Medicare Part B premiums, which is done by formula. And the Medicare Part B premiums were slated to be increased on those who were eligible for the increase. So if you were not both in Social Security and Medicare, you were going to be hit with a $54 a month increase, which was untenable and really would have hurt people. Congress worked on that. Our community weighed in quite a bit. And that was reduced to an $18 a month increase, which is still an increase, and you know, not thrilled with it. But $3 of that increase is temporary. So we felt that that was, again, a strong victory for our community and for folks who you know, aren't in Social Security.
Great, thank you. So it seems as if, in summary, you know, 2015 was a good year. A lot of activity at the end of the year. So let's shift gears a little bit and let's look ahead at 2016. Bailey, I want to start with you. What do you foresee at the state level for 2016? Certainly, I think there were at least one state election and one local election that will have an impact, but very curious to hear about your thoughts.
Yeah, so let me actually start with the elections that you mentioned. So there were two that were of interest at the end of last year. The first was the Kentucky gubernatorial election. The candidate who won the election had campaigned on converting the state employees and the teachers into a 401k style system. That legislature just went into session about a week ago, so we have not seen a bill filed yet, but that's definitely something we're keeping a close eye on for Kentucky and seeing if they move in that kind of direction for either the state system or the teacher system in Kentucky. So that's a big one to watch. The other election that was important as far as pensions was the Houston mayoral election. The candidate who won in Houston, on the other hand, though, had run to protect pensions, which is a good thing. You know, there are still going to be some budget issues that the city has to work through, but we've got a good group of people on the ground who will be working there to make sure that that's done in a way that does not hurt retirement security for city workers in Houston. The other kind of interesting thing that happened in Texas at the end of last year that I think will be worth watching, not just there, but you know, potentially for national impact. I think the first time I came here, I talked a bit about the Arnold Foundation as a primary funder of anti-pension work all across the country. So one of the research folks that they have, Josh McGee, was appointed to the Texas Pension Review Board at the end of last year by the governor of Texas. You know, I'm concerned for a couple of reasons. You know, one, you know, their goal is not necessarily promoting and protecting defined benefit pensions. And even though Texas does not go back into legislative session until 2017, from that position on the board, he'll have the opportunity to ask for studies and you know, do some different things like that I think could be really troubling. I'm also curious to see if that gives him, you know, more quote unquote legitimacy if he's talking about what other states should do, because now he has that appointment to the board. So that's a bit of a concern to us. I think as it pertains to Houston, there's an interesting issue in Houston particularly and with Texas cities called local control. And one of the things that the Arnold Foundation pushed in the mayoral election in Houston and has pushed legislatively in Texas is for local control of pension systems instead of the system that they've had in Texas for years, where it's between the state works with the city and the folks who are in the pension system to make sure everybody's happy with any kind of pension system changes. And so the local control argument is really just a way to allow the city to make changes without having the consensus that they've had as a part of the process in Texas. So, whether or not Josh McGee tries to push for that kind of bill that would impact not just Houston, but all of the cities in Texas, will be something of interesting to watch how that unfolds this year and when Texas goes back into session in 2017. So those are the two elections that had quite a bit of an impact on what we'll be looking at for pensions this year. Otherwise, I think kind of thematically, one of the things we may see is this kind of side-by-side hybrid idea. I've actually heard folks in Arizona mention it. I've heard folks in Louisiana mention it. That's an idea that Pew pushes quite hard for. They were very active in Pennsylvania and kind of the end of year skirmish that I was mentioning. So I think I would just say to folks, if you hear of a side-by-side hybrid, that's not an idea that's coming out of nowhere, and it's not something that's being pitched unique to your state or your situation. So if you hear about that, please let us know, because we want to make sure that we're getting information to lawmakers about Pew. And again, they're getting a good $4 or $5 million contribution from the Arnold Foundation to push these kind of ideas that really just undermine retirement security for public workers. So like I mentioned.
Before you go on, just two quick thoughts. One is, in terms of vernacular, I think I much prefer the word combination versus hybrid.
Sure.
I think hybrid just has a connotation of something that's positive.
Right,
So,
that's absolutely right.
So I think maybe something more descriptive as a combination plan versus a hybrid plan. It's something that the community should probably adopt. And then the second point is, I believe you have a website regarding Arnold, right?
Yes. So truthaboutjohnarnold.com is the website that NPPC maintains that publishes information about where they're spending money and the different campaigns that they've been involved in. So it's a great resource, and it digs beyond just money that they might. There is the money for Pew listed there, but there's also state think tanks that they give money to and people like that. So it's a great resource if you're curious about whether or not he's been active in your state. And to your point on calling them combination plans, we've put together talking points. So if you're seeing something like that introduced in your state, we also encourage you to just call them, they're pushing toward 401ks and really emphasize that piece of the structure. And again, emphasizing that they're reducing retirement security, whatever you want to call it, right? It's just a way that they're trying to be more creative at getting rid of retirement security. And we're happy to share those talking points with any state that's facing it this year. So that's one of the big things. Other things to watch for in California. Reed and DeMaio are still working on ballot measures in California. They tried that a couple of years ago and weren't able to get the funding to move it forward. This year they were unhappy with the language that they were given for the first measure they submitted. They submitted 2 additional measures. The language has been approved by the Attorney General, and they are still, I believe, poll testing and deciding whether or not they can really move forward with either of those in 2016. If they do, that would be something really big to watch for the November ballot in California. And the other states that we'll keep an eye on, again, I kind of mentioned Arizona, Michigan, because of the SB 102 being held over. Wisconsin, again, has a couple of bills that were held over from last session. Pennsylvania, the budget address for 2016 is scheduled for February 2nd, I believe, even though they don't have a budget for 2015. So, I just don't know what's going to go on in Pennsylvania.
They can skip a year.
Yeah, right. But we'll definitely, that's a state that we're, going to keep an eye on. Oklahoma is another one. There are a couple of states that are going to be dealing with pretty big budget problems, Oklahoma being one of those. In their case, it's from some tax cuts that were given a couple of years ago, and so now they have a revenue shortage. And so there's been talk of some consolidation and things like that in Oklahoma. And so we'll want to keep an eye on what they do there. So that's kind of what we're looking at for 2016. I'm not expecting. I'm hoping it will be a good year like 2015 was. But if there are states that are on the webcast that I didn't mention, or you're hearing rumblings of something, we're always interested anytime you hear of a study commission or any of these other kind of proposals and alternatives to move away from defined benefit pensions. We're here to be a resource on that.
And what's an email address or a good contact information that folks on the webcast can contact you?
Sure. So it's bchilders@protectpensions.org. So that's BCHILDERS@protectpensions.org. And our website, we just revamped at the end of last year. We've got a blog now, and we're putting out much more regular content that we hope will be helpful to folks. And we really revamped our social media as well. So we have, good share graphics and things like that break down a lot of these very complicated issues into stuff that I think is easier to understand and help us share and get other people working with us to protect pensions in the states.
Great, thank you, Bailey. Angela, let me turn back to you to talk about 2016. So again, just going back to where we left off, which is the comment period. Obviously, it's right around the corner, I'm sure, and actually I know that it's been weighing on you. And
working hard, Hank.
Working hard, yes.
Hank.
So that's probably the first thing that's coming up, and then, but it's at the state level. There's a lot of other things going on.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, 2016 is going to be what I hope another exciting year. And so what we're looking at is the legislative activity in the states to continue, although as Bailey points out, and we all know, it's an election year. So whether we'll see the level of activity in the states that we saw in 2015 and 2016, it might not be as active simply because of the presidential politics and generally political dynamics in the states. But I think, again, we need to see DOL finalize this rule as quickly as possible because that will have an impact on state legislative activities and implementation activities also as well. For DOL to move quickly as they've promised to do will, again, give that certainty because it's a proposed rule right now. Right. So absent that finalization, some states may be hesitant to get in just because they're not sure what the direction things are going to go. So in terms of the legislative outlook, I think there are a few states to keep our eyes on. And, again, because of the DOL policies, both on the IRA side as well as ERISA-covered type options like multiple employer plans, we have a wide range of options that have now become available to states. So what will be interesting to see is how these models continue to evolve. And will states that would have liked to have done something other than an IRA type model be able to, in fact, accomplish that? And that would be significant to see an evolution in the models that we see in the states. So, there are a number of study states that have been very active, and so that work will spill on over and continue into 2016. States like Maryland that are in study mode, Vermont is in study mode, New York City is in study mode, Minnesota is in study mode. So to the extent that these states will continue and wrap up and report out recommendations for legislative activity, those states all have some potential for action in 2016. There are obviously politically diversity among the states. So we have red states and we have purple states and we have blue states. So most of the activities so far, quite honestly, have been in blue states. To the extent, however, I think another positive development has been increasingly, it's always been a bipartisan issue, really, with respect to understanding the problems of retirement security. I think what we've now seen is politically more of that bipartisan understanding translating into legislative action. And so hopefully in 2016, we'll see a few states like Utah, which had a retirement study committee. And I've been very fortunate in my capacity at the Georgetown Center to have presented to several states in 2015, Utah and Vermont and Maryland and in coalitions in Minnesota. So it's been great to have that opportunity. But hopefully states like Utah and Indiana, red states, we already hear and are already seeing drafts of legislative language and proposals that they are contemplating. So we have hope that, again, in the spirit of bipartisanship and embracing and understanding the problems that our workers face and trying to save for retirement, that we'll see more and more states take up the issues. And again, a lot of study states evolving into their legislative proposals. But I think equally as important for us to keep our eyes on and what the center will be involved in addition to the legislative action and adding more states to the mix, is we all have an interest in making sure that the states that have already enacted laws, so California, Illinois, Oregon, Washington State, Massachusetts, so in particular states like Illinois and Oregon and California has to go back to its legislature and have its final plan approved, so does Oregon. So Illinois is really the one state that's literally off to the races in terms of full implementation mode. But we have a great interest in helping them with their program design and management issues and making sure that over the next 18 months, these programs are going to get off the ground successfully. Because again, people will be watching. So again, some states that are sitting in the sidelines for the 2017 sessions will not only be waiting to see the DOL finalizes its policies, but also they'll also have the benefits of saying, okay, I've been watching these other states trying to get these programs off the ground. How well does this work? You know, so we have an interest because right now for many of the states, Oregon, Illinois, California, that turn-on switch is the summer of 2017. So we want to make sure when they start turning this on and employees are making contributions that things are going to work really, really well. And so we're just as invested in making sure of implementation success and playing a role by helping to share best practices, what we know internationally, and bringing experts to the table and working hands-on with the states to help accomplish that. So again, success on the implementation side will only continue to feed the legislative activity and the momentum in the states. So we're very excited. I think 2016 could be a year both for great progress in showing how these plans can in fact work, and in addition, hopefully we will see a few more states, given a presidential election season, still step in, and more bipartisanship reflected in that legislative activity.
So what I do find interesting and I think good is that in terms of outlook for states, your list and your list are different. So that there isn't a potential for certain state legislatures or policymakers to confuse preserving defined benefit plans for public employees with expanding retirement security for the private sector. So I think that's a good development.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I think it's an exciting conversation too, because I think, you know, the more we're focusing people on the overall retirement security crisis, the better. And we shouldn't be trying to take it away from people who have it, but really thinking about how do we help more people be ready for retirement. So I'm really excited to hear all that.
And I think in the context of talking about retirement security, you know, for those who look at defined benefit plans with skepticism and a desire to perhaps change that, you know, from my perspective, is it really a question, are we going to try to help raise everybody, or are we trying to bring everybody, you know, to what extent do we deteriorate in terms of benefits and retirement security for Americans? So I think we really need to engage and really focus on the overall objectives, because I think people tend to get caught up in the process or the design, when we really need to focus, what are we trying to achieve here? And in all cases, we want more Americans to have lifetime income. We want people to be able to retire and to have their savings and their resources last as long as they live. Again, they fear outliving their savings more than death. So the concept of lifetime income and having that discussion, I think, is a really important one. And so people focus on the fiscal issues. You know, it's politics being what it is, but we need to focus on the problem, and we need to focus on what is the solution. We're not just talking about savings for savings' sake. We need to talk about what that translates into retirement security and focus on that. And whether it's in Connecticut, where they're looking at, you know, they are looking at an IRA model with a 6% default contribution, but in the concept of lifetime income, talking about a 50% back-end annuitization, because they want to help people try to have that income last as long as they're aging. So it's important to keep an eye on what we're trying to accomplish in the big picture and make sure that we're helping all Americans move in that direction.
Great, thank you. So Tony, we began with you, so I guess we'll close with you in terms of outlook. What might be happening here in Washington, D.C. for the balance of the year?
Well, thank you, Hank. I'll continue the theme of the election year and the truncated nature of the legislative session. But it's truncated in one sense, and then it could be elongated with a lame duck session after the elections. But we expect Congress to be extremely busy here right up until they adjourn for the party conventions and the summer break. So that'll take them through mid-July. We expect the appropriations process to be accelerated. We expect a lot of things to move forward quickly. In that vein, I mentioned earlier, the Puerto Rico assistance legislation is something that Speaker Paul Ryan of the House has said across the House floor by the end of March. That's what he would like to see. He has a good deal to say about whether that's going to happen. If you think about the calendar, that is March 23rd in essence because of the recess for Easter. So March 23rd, we expect Puerto Rico legislation to move through the House. The contours of it, unclear. Whether it includes the reporting language requirements under PEPTA or the Annuity Accumulation Act, we will be working hard on that to see that those unrelated pieces of legislation targeted at state and local plans, we think in a negative way, will not be included in Puerto Rico legislation. I'll go back to secure choice just for a second because there was a hearing at the Ways and Means Oversight Subcommittee, and I'm sure Angela is well aware of it, where Chairman Roscom of Illinois raised questions about the direction that DOL was taking. So I expect there to be continued interest in that from the House Ways and Means Committee. Senate Finance Committee has yet to be at least publicly looking at it. So that is also a possibility for 2016. There is legislation introduced by the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, the new chairman, Kevin Brady of Texas, Houston, Texas, that would reform and for some replace the windfall elimination provision, which is one of the so-called Social Security offsets. It affects those who have a pension benefit from non-covered employment, which is certainly a lot of our state and local workers. Chairman Brady, again, being the chairman, has a lot to say about whether that legislation moves. I think it will. I don't know if it will move individually or as part of a larger package. You know, he breaks people into two subsets and uses January 1, 2017 as the kind of dividing line. Those who are currently having their Social Security benefits reduced by WEP or would reach age 62 by the end of calendar year 2016 would have a relief from the WEP penalty. The WEP penalty wouldn't go away, but there would be some relief. Those who reach age 62 on or after January 1, 2017 would have a completely new formula based on their actual work history. There have been questions raised about how this is done. Are there losers in this process? Congress is going to dig into it more. It's a bipartisan effort so far. Congressman Richie Neal of Massachusetts, a senior member of the Ways and Means Committee, is on board. So I think before it moves, a lot of these questions are going to be raised and dealt with. There is continued interest in the issue of the pickup, and a lot of discussion about hybrid plans, side-by-side plans. What was your combination plans? And whether the issue on the pickup, which is somewhat of an arcane part of the Internal Revenue Code, allows the employer to essentially pay for the employee contribution. The pickup has been an issue because where you have created a new plan or tier, some municipalities, states would like to have the employee in the legacy plan be able to elect into the new plan or new tier. Treasury and IRS have said no to that because it would be a cash or deferred arrangement, which would affect your take-home pay. And they feel that looks too close to a 401k model, where each year you can select between plans. Who knows how many plans could be created? So those are some of the arguments they've used against that. Others have said, well, look, this is really a benefit and could promote the retention of defined benefit plans if there was some flexibility given. So I think this is going to continue to be an issue, and Congress we may see some legislation introduced on that. I have two lines drawn in my notes here, and on the right side of it I have the great beyond, because the great beyond is the post-presidential election world, and it's the new president and it's the new Congress, what would be the 115th Congress. I do know one thing, that the dynamic will change, probably dramatically. Tax reform, House Republicans, by all expectations, should retain the majority. Speaker Ryan, Chairman Brady are very strong proponents of tax reform. Tax reform is the ultimate catch-all legislation in the tax world. So any of the areas that I've talked about could become issues in tax reform. So we just have to bear that in mind as we go forward into that great beyond.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So before we open up for questions, I do want to remind our audience members that additional information and delving deeper into the topics that we discussed there is an opportunity for NCPERS members to do that coming up within the next 2 weeks. First is the Healthcare Symposium, which will be held here in Washington, D.C. on January 24th, as well as the day after, on Monday, January 25th, we'll have our annual legislative conference. So I encourage folks to register for those two programs. If the topics we've touched upon today are of interest and you want to learn more about them. So in terms of questions, I have one from the audience. I think it basically goes to everybody, which is something that you all touched upon, which is the presidential election. And so to what degree have you detected, or has there been any sort of influence, as far as you're aware, either at the state, federal, or in state retirement initiatives? Are presidential politics influencing what could happen in 2016? Bailey,
Sure,
you
I'm happy to start.
Yeah.
I'll say I'm actually very disappointed at the lack of discussion of retirement security among presidential candidates, and truthfully, that's on both sides. We've done a little bit of looking into it. Most of what you've seen discussed is Social Security, and whether or not you should, have people work longer or make modifications to benefits or enhance benefits. But that's really been the main thing that we have seen on retirement security coming from the presidential candidates. My hope is that maybe in election years beyond this, they want to campaign on retirement security and doing better. But that hasn't been what we've seen, at least so far this year.
Tony?
I think I would agree with what Bailey has said. There's been very little. I can detect almost no discussion of retirement security. It doesn't seem to me to be an issue for the primary season. I think it's possible in the general election that we could see more of these issues that are less partisan in certain respects. I know they can be very partisan at times, but when we're talking about issues to attract the center, when you're talking about a general election, we might see more discussion of it, I hope.
Okay. Angela?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think early on here in primary season, it's just not top of the list. I think as the season continues to evolve, I think as candidates, the two candidates will evolve, I think we'll probably, I'm optimistic that we will see something more robust than just talking about Social Security in the context of retirement from the candidates. So I think that will be a positive development. I really do think that certainly on the issue of the gap among private sector workers, I do think that candidates see that. And I think it's a matter of time. Obviously, there are a lot of issues that candidates, some rise to, national security issues, as an example, that maybe be, obviously a very high priority. But when they deal with their economic platforms, I'm optimistic. I think we will see a broadening of the thinking about retirement security, and it won't just be focused on Social Security, but they'll understand the much larger dynamics of what's happening to individuals, to workers, and to families in this country. And ultimately, what that means, if you're a president or a governor for your for your federal budget as well as your state and local budgets.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And just connecting those dots.
So I think everybody is aware that yesterday there was a significant Supreme Court hearing, Friedrich versus California Teachers Association, which talks about, or the case is really about agency fee for public sector unions, so that those public employees who are represented by the union but disagree with their political activities, they can opt out of contributing towards those political campaigns. However, they still do need to pay for their fair share of the collective bargaining benefits and such. So the question is, to what degree do you think a negative decision, or let me rephrase that, if the Supreme Court in the Friedrich case turns the Abood case, which allowed for agency fee, to what degree do you think it will impact your respective areas? Retirement security for federal and at the state level, trying to protect the defined benefit pension plans.
Do you want to start this time, or?
No, I mean,
Tony, why don't you go? Yeah.
I'll go, but I don't know that it's going to have a great impact on what Congress is doing.
Okay.
I certainly think it's an important decision, an important legal issue. And I think from what we all read in the newspaper and online this morning, it looks like the court may have already made up its mind. So, you know, I'm not a Supreme Court prognosticator in any way, but I think at the federal level, rhetorically, it may have a powerful, for Republicans, conservatives, it may be a powerful tool. I don't know that it's necessarily a legislative issue. Certainly, of course, it could on the ground have a political impact.
Sure. Yeah, so I would say it's very difficult to say at this point what it would look like. My hope would be that states will realize, regardless of what the Supreme Court says, that pensions are an important vehicle to providing retirement security. And I think that that's what we would be looking at, you know, when we're talking to folks in states, is that, you know, for public employees, for a number of reasons, you know, whether it's the workforce management aspect of a pension, you know, being able to recruit quality people that you can retain in jobs, especially those that have very high training costs, or, you know, you think of jobs like a teacher, where you probably want someone who's got some experience teaching your kids in the classroom. And just understanding that those things about a pension are going to continue to be important for the state workforce. And so I hope that's what states will continue to recognize. Like I said, I think they did this year in session, and I hope that, you know, whatever the outcome of the court case, that they still realize that pensions are important, and realize that there's a lot of other people in their state who are hurting as they look at their prospects for retirement. And I hope that they'll stay focused on those things.
Angela, do you see any impact from your side?
In all honesty, it's not. I haven't really tracked the case, so you know, obviously, to the extent that it would have an impact on what we're trying to do with respect to the private sector gap, you know, that's something that we would want to take a look at and address and be sensitive to.
Well, so then let me turn to you and ask, in terms of states implementing, what are some of the lessons learned? What are some of the innovative things that you've run across in 2015 or earlier?
Yeah, well, you know, I think this probably for folks that whether it's at the state legislative level or at the federal level, I think, you know, legislation is, you know, we've often heard it's like, you know, making sausage, right? It's not pretty to look at. So I think, you know, one of the benefits of the Georgetown Center in terms of being sort of a resource for states is really sharing sort of lessons learned. And from an implementation perspective, I think as we look at 2016 and beyond and states crafting their legislative proposals, there really are sort of lessons learned, because as we look at states like California and Illinois and Oregon, there was some work done ahead of time before the legislation was crafted, sort of understanding the nature of the population, who was going to be served, how many were going to be served, sort of how they respond to different characteristics of program design. Like default contribution levels, and if you provide guarantees and annuitization, that kind of thing. But I think, you know, the lessons that have been learned is, you know, to the extent you can, and we see what the study states, there's sort of a more common sense sequential way that ideally you would develop a legislative proposal, right? First, study your population, figure out who's going to be affected by what you're proposing to do. Do outreach to stakeholders, spend time with small businesses, with unions, with other organizations, and understand the needs of workers in your state. And spend that time getting that information. In some respects, some of that work now in some of the implementation states is now being done and sort of being fed back into trying to adjust on program design. And quite honestly, where the legislation was very prescriptive, it makes it a little bit more challenging, because if they have to live within that legislative framework already created. So getting that information ahead of time, understanding your population, understanding what your goals and objectives are, and then crafting your legislation is a more, you know, orderly way, sensible, sort of common sense way that you want to see it roll out. That all being said, when you do design your program, I think the biggest lesson learned, and that we're seeing in some of the legislative proposals developing now, is don't tie your hands more than you need to. So for whether the state or the delegated authorities that will be setting up these programs, leave discretion to figure out how you want to design these programs. Don't needlessly tie your hand with a lot of prescriptive details, because you may learn that you may choose to do a different type of vehicle, investment vehicle or option. You might want to do something different with the default rate. There may be things that you will want to tweak in terms of investment and administrative structures. So give yourself some freedom to make those changes, and don't, because we know how hard it is to go back to a state legislature. I'm not sure the feds understand that it's just as difficult to go back to a state legislature and make a change as it is Congress. But I think the biggest lesson learned is give yourself that freedom. Don't overly tie your hands. And quite honestly, I think those that have been opposed to these initiatives at the state level have actually encouraged detail, because I think they do know it ties hands and can make things more difficult. So I think legislators understand that, and they're saying, hey, we want to create this entity, but we're going to empower this entity to figure these details out. And I think that's true both, politically across the spectrum, Republicans to Democrats.
Great point. Tony, so the PEPTA and the accumulation plan sort of came up out of nowhere at the end of the year. What do you think about 2016? How likely is it to actually gain momentum, either one of those, either separately or collectively, and actually become law in 2016?
I think we have to take it very seriously because they are being advanced by the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Senator Hatch of Utah. So if you're going to take anything seriously, I would take his proposals seriously. I know we have colleagues in the community who feel, that we've done a good job keeping the lid on these particular proposals with lobbying efforts, both with Republicans and with Democrats. But Senator Hatch is very adept at the legislative process after his decades of being there, and he's not only the Finance Committee chairman, but he's the president pro tem of the Senate. So I mean, he's in a position to move legislation. So I take the threat very seriously, and I think we're going to have a lot of hard work to do in 2016 on those proposals.
Okay. Bailey, let me wrap up with you. Similar to the question I asked Angela, what are some of the lessons learned or sort of creative things that you saw states do or coalitions in the states do to help preserve the defined benefit plan for the public employees of that state?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are a couple of states that I think that have done some really great things. Colorado comes to mind as one. So Colorado Para is very active on advocating on their own behalf, and I think that's something that's really good to see a system do. So they produce economic reports to talk about how pension dollars benefit communities all across the state of Colorado, and they produce these what they call Para bucks, which basically a retiree could take into their diner or dry cleaner or whatever and say, this is a pension buck, and this is on the back. It's got a map of their local area that says how many pension dollars go into the local economy. So doing stuff like that is a really good way to break down what pensions mean to people who maybe don't understand it, right?
Yeah.
If you're the local business owner and you don't have a pension, maybe you don't know why it matters, but if a retiree is coming in talking to you about their pension dollars and that's what they're using to come frequent your business, that's a great thing. So that's one thing that I really love that Colorado does that I'd like to see more states do. Louisiana did a similar study of parish by parish, the kind of money that pension dollars have in the economy, which again I think is just helping people look at it in a different way. So that's one thing that I think is a really just a great tool that there's a lot of different ways you can do it and share that information, and it's a good way that systems can partner with people who are already retired or people who are about to be retired to really talk about pensions in a different way. And I think anytime we can find different ways to communicate about the importance of pensions and what they really mean for people's daily lives and for their, the local economies that they live in, I think it's great.
Great, thank you. Well, so I want to conclude by thanking Angela, Tony, and Bailey for once again joining us today. And most importantly, I want to thank the audience members of this webcast for staying with us. We've gone a little bit over the hour that we've allotted, but again, as we started off by saying, there was a lot to cover, and I think we certainly did a good summary of what we saw in 2015 and what we can expect to see in 2016. And I would say, in closing, stay tuned for our July mid-year review, which we'll have on our website, and the specific dates and time through social media and on the website. So, thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy to do it.